When Elvis froze on stage, no one knew that this embarrassing moment would transform into one of the greatest triumphs of his career. The spotlight was blazing down on him, 18,000 faces staring up expectantly, and suddenly the king of rock and roll stood there speechless, his mouth moving but no words coming out. The arena fell into an eerie silence that seemed to stretch forever. But what happened next would become one of the most beautiful accidents in music history. It was July 31, 1976, at the Spectrum Arena in Philadelphia. Elvis was in the middle of his "Love Me Tender" tour, performing night after night to sold-out crowds across America. But this particular evening was different. In the third row sat a young boy named Tommy Martinez, only 8 years old, battling leukemia and wearing a baseball cap to cover his bald head from chemotherapy treatments. Tommy's mother, Maria, had saved for months to afford these tickets. Her son's doctors had given him 6 months to live, and his one wish was to see Elvis Presley perform live. She clutched his small hand as they watched their hero take the stage, knowing this might be one of their last precious memories together. Elvis appeared that night in his iconic white jumpsuit with the golden eagle design, but something was off. Those closest to him could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of performing hundreds of shows, the pressure of being America's most beloved entertainer. He'd been struggling with his own demons, his own sense of mortality, though the world didn't know it yet. The show began like any other. "That's All Right" thundered through the arena, followed by "Hound Dog" and "Don't Be Cruel." The crowd was electric, singing along to every word, swaying to every rhythm. Elvis moved across the stage with that familiar charisma, that magical connection he had with his audience. But as he launched into "Are You Lonesome Tonight?" something went wrong. Elvis reached the second verse, opened his mouth, and nothing. The words that had flowed from his lips thousands of times before simply vanished. He stood frozen under the blazing stage lights, his backup singers continuing their harmonies, the orchestra playing on, but the king himself had gone completely silent. The arena held its breath. 18,000 people watched as their idol struggled with something as simple as remembering lyrics he'd sung since 1960. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Elvis's band members exchanged worried glances. His manager, Colonel Parker, watched nervously from the wings. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to Elvis. Not to the man who could command any stage, any crowd, anywhere in the world. Tommy Martinez, the little boy in the third row, tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mama, why did Elvis stop singing?" Maria didn't know how to answer. Her heart broke seeing the confusion in her son's eyes, the same eyes that had lit up with such joy just moments before. But then something magical happened. From somewhere in the crowd, a voice began to sing the missing verse. Then another voice joined in. And another. Within seconds, 18,000 people were singing the words that Elvis had forgotten, their voices rising together in perfect harmony, filling the arena with a sound more beautiful than any professional choir. Elvis stood there, tears beginning to form in his eyes, listening to his audience sing his song back to him. The man who had given his voice to the world was now receiving the gift of thousands of voices in return. He raised his hand to his heart, overwhelmed by the moment, by the pure love washing over him from the crowd. Subscribe and comment now, because what happens next will show you why this moment changed everything. When the verse ended, Elvis slowly raised the microphone back to his lips. But instead of continuing the song, he did something unprecedented. He stopped the music entirely. The orchestra fell silent. The backup singers stopped their harmonies. The only sound in the arena was Elvis's voice, raw with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow reaching every corner of that massive space, "in 21 years of performing, I have never experienced anything like what just happened." He paused, scanning the crowd, his eyes somehow finding Tommy Martinez in the third row. The little boy was clutching his mother's hand, his eyes wide with wonder, his baseball cap slightly askew on his small head. "Music," Elvis continued, "music isn't about perfection. It's about connection. And tonight, all of you just reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place." The crowd began to applaud, but Elvis held up his hand. He wasn't finished. "I see you out there," he said, his voice growing stronger. "I see the families who saved up for these tickets. I see the couples on their first date, the grandparents sharing this with their grandchildren, the young people discovering what music can do to your soul." His eyes found Tommy again, and something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps. A understanding that life is fragile, that moments like this are precious, that sometimes the most beautiful things happen when everything goes wrong. "Tonight, I forgot the words to a song I've sung 10,000 times, Elvis said with a slight smile. "But you reminded me of every single word. Not just the lyrics, but the meaning behind them. The loneliness we all feel sometimes. The need to be connected. The power of being together. But here's the incredible part of this story. The part nobody expected. Elvis walked to the edge of the stage, directly in front of where Tommy and his mother were sitting. He knelt down, bringing himself to eye level with the young boy who was fighting the battle of his life. "Son," Elvis said, speaking directly to Tommy though his words were amplified throughout the arena, "I don't know your name, but I can see something special in your eyes. I can see courage. I can see strength. And I want you to have something." Elvis reached into his pocket and pulled out his own personal microphone cover, a small piece of fabric that had been with him through countless performances, through the highs and lows of his career. It wasn't much to look at, just a simple black cloth, but to Elvis, it represented every song he'd ever sung, every crowd he'd ever moved, every heart he'd ever touched. "This has been with me for 15 years, Elvis told Tommy, holding the microphone cover out to him. "It's been there for every song, every show, every moment when music made magic happen. And tonight, it witnessed something more magical than anything I've ever seen on stage." Tommy's mother lifted him up so he could reach for the gift. As the small boy's fingers closed around the fabric, Elvis leaned closer and whispered something that only Tommy could hear, "Keep fighting, little man. The world needs more courage like yours." Then Elvis stood up, raised his microphone one more time, and said to the crowd, "Now, let's sing this song together. All of us. As one voice." What happened next defied description. 18,000 voices joined Elvis as he sang, "Are You Lonesome Tonight?" Not as separate individuals in a crowd, but as one unified sound, one shared moment of pure human connection. The song had never sounded more beautiful, more meaningful, more alive. When it ended, the applause didn't stop for 7 full minutes. People were crying, hugging strangers, reaching out to touch the lives around them. Elvis had transformed a moment of personal failure into something that touched every soul in that arena. Share and subscribe to make sure this story lives forever. 6 months later, Tommy Martinez passed away in his sleep, his mother holding his hand. But clutched in his other hand was Elvis's microphone cover, the piece of fabric that had become his most treasured possession. He'd told everyone who would listen about the night Elvis sang just for him, about how the king of rock and roll had knelt down and spoken directly to his heart. Maria kept the microphone cover after Tommy died, and eventually donated it to Graceland, where it sits today in a small display case with a plaque that reads, "Sometimes the most beautiful music happens when we forget the words and remember the feeling." Elvis himself was never quite the same after that night in Philadelphia. Band members and close friends noticed a change in him. He began dedicating more time to connecting with individual fans, to looking out into the crowd and really seeing the people who had given him everything. The incident reminded him that his gift wasn't just his voice, it was his ability to touch human hearts. In interviews after that tour, Elvis would often reference, "The night I forgot the words." He'd say it was one of the most important performances of his career, not because everything went right, but because everything went wrong in exactly the right way. The microphone cover that Elvis gave to Tommy became a symbol of something larger. It represented the invisible thread that connects performer to audience, the unspoken understanding that music is about more than entertainment, it's about healing, about hope, about finding light in the darkest moments. Years later, when music historians look back at Elvis's career, they point to that night in Philadelphia as a turning point. Not because it was his best vocal performance or his most energetic show, but because it was the night he showed the world that being human, being vulnerable, being imperfect, being real, was more powerful than being perfect. The recording of that show, bootlegged by a fan in the audience, still circulates today. You can hear it all: the moment Elvis forgets the words, the silence that follows, the crowd singing together, and finally Elvis's voice, thick with emotion, thanking his audience for reminding him why music matters. Tommy Martinez never got to grow up, never got to see Elvis perform again, never got to pursue his own dreams of maybe one day making music. But for one magical night in Philadelphia, he was part of something that will live forever. The night 18,000 people became one voice, the night Elvis forgot the words and found something far more valuable than any lyric ever written. And somewhere in Graceland, a simple black microphone cover sits behind glass, a reminder that the most beautiful accidents can become the most treasured memories, and that sometimes, forgetting the words is the only way to remember what really matters. But the story doesn't end there. What happened in Philadelphia that night created ripples that would spread far beyond that single performance. Word of Elvis's moment of vulnerability, and the crowd's incredible response, began to circulate among his fan community. Letters poured into Graceland from people who had been at the show, sharing their own perspectives on what they had witnessed. One letter, from a Vietnam veteran named Robert Chen who had been in the audience that night, described how Elvis's admission of imperfection had helped him deal with his own struggles with PTSD. When the king himself could stand up there and be human, it gave me permission to be human too, Robert wrote. I'd been carrying around this idea that I had to be strong all the time, that showing weakness was failure. But watching Elvis that night, seeing how beautiful that moment became, it changed something in me. Another letter came from Sarah Williams, a teacher from South Philadelphia, who had brought her elderly father to the show. Her father had been battling depression since her mother's death 6 months earlier, barely speaking or leaving the house. But something about that night, about seeing an arena full of strangers come together to lift up their fallen hero, had awakened something in him. He started singing again after that, Sarah wrote. Not just Elvis songs, but the old songs he used to sing to my mother. The house has music in it again. Elvis himself was deeply moved by these letters. His assistant, Lamar Fike, later recalled how Elvis would spend hours reading each one, sometimes with tears in his eyes. He always knew his music touched people, Fike remembered, but I don't think he realized how much his humanity meant to them. That night in Philadelphia showed him that people didn't just love Elvis the performer, they loved Elvis the man. The incident also changed how Elvis approached his performances. In subsequent shows, he began to speak more directly to his audience, sharing stories and creating moments of genuine connection rather than just running through his setlist. He started dedicating songs to specific people in the crowd, the elderly couple celebrating their 50th anniversary, the young soldier heading off to deployment, the teenager who had driven 12 hours just to see him perform. Musicians who worked with Elvis during this period noticed the change immediately. His guitarist, James Burton, observed, before Philadelphia, Elvis was always professional, always gave everything he had. But after that night, there was something different. He wasn't just performing for the crowd anymore, he was performing with them. There was this communion, I guess you'd call it. The microphone cover itself became part of rock and roll legend. After Tommy Martinez's mother donated it to Graceland, it was placed in a special exhibit called The Human Touch, which featured items that represented Elvis's connection with his fans. Visitors often stood for long minutes in front of that simple piece of black fabric, reading the story of Tommy and Elvis and that magical night in Philadelphia. The exhibit grew over the years as more fans shared their own stories of Elvis's kindness and humanity. There was the letter he wrote to a fan's daughter who was struggling with bullying at school. The photograph of him visiting a children's hospital in Memphis, sitting bedside with young patients, his usual entourage waiting patiently in the hallway while he spent hours just talking and singing softly. The receipt from a jewelry store in Las Vegas where he had spontaneously bought wedding rings for a couple he'd met in an elevator who couldn't afford their own ceremony. These weren't publicity stunts or calculated career moves. They were quiet moments of grace, instances where Elvis used his fame and resources to touch individual lives in meaningful ways. And it all traced back to that night in Philadelphia when he forgot the words to a song and remembered something far more important. The recording of that performance, still passed from fan to fan decades later, captures something that studio albums and professional concerts never could. It captures the sound of vulnerability transformed into strength, of failure becoming triumph, of a single moment when the barrier between performer and audience completely disappeared. Music historians have analyzed that performance countless times, but they always come back to the same conclusion: it wasn't about the technical aspects of singing or showmanship. It was about Elvis revealing that beneath the jumpsuit and the legend was a man who could be hurt, who could fail, who could be touched by the love of others. And paradoxically, that humanity made him more powerful, not less. Today, when artists speak about authenticity and connection with their audience, many point back to that night in Philadelphia as the gold standard. It wasn't planned or scripted or focus grouped. It was real, and raw, and utterly transformative for everyone who witnessed it. The lesson of Tommy Martinez and Elvis Presley and 18,000 voices singing as one isn't just about music. It's about the power of shared humanity, about how our greatest failures can become our most meaningful successes when we're willing to be vulnerable, to be real, to let others lift us up when we fall. And in the end, perhaps that's the most fitting legacy for the night Elvis forgot the words, not as a cautionary tale about the pressure of performance, but as a reminder that the most beautiful music happens when we stop trying to be perfect and start trying to be truly, authentically human.